All right, so we are starting the respiratory system next, and we're looking at 7.1 today, which is structures of the respiratory system. So the respiratory system, its main function is to ensure that oxygen is brought to each cell in the body and that carbon dioxide can leave each cell and be removed from the body. The surface area or the respiratory surface, it has to be large enough for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide to occur at fast enough rates to meet the body's needs. And respiration must take place in a moist environment so that the oxygen and carbon dioxide are able to dissolve in water. So there's 4 stages of respiration. So breathing, external respiration, that's the exchange of gases between the air and lungs. There's internal respiration, that's the exchange of gases between the blood and the cells. And then there's cellular respiration and the production of ATP. So here we're seeing breathing, the process by which air enters and leaves the lungs. External respiration takes place in the lungs. It involves the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air and the blood. And then here we're looking at internal respiration that takes place within the body. It involves the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules between the blood and tissue fluids. And then cellular respiration, which is the production of ATP in the body cells. All right, so here is the respiratory tract. So we have the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, and together they form this common area here called the pharynx. This here is the tongue. This flap-like structure here is called the epiglottis, and it makes sure that you're not, that food does not enter your windpipe. This is the larynx. There's the trachea, the 2 lungs. The trachea branches off into 2 sections here called the bronchi. The bronchi will branch off into smaller structures called bronchioles. Here we see the rib cage, and then we see this large muscular diaphragm here. If we have a close-up of the bronchioles here, we see this structure, which is called an alveolus, or alveoli for plural. And so here's that bronchiole tube, and then we have this alveolar sac, and we can see that there's blood vessels and capillary network that is wrapped around the alveolus. So the upper respiratory tract, air can enter into the nose or the mouth, and the nasal passages in the upper respiratory tract, they warm, moisten, and clean the incoming air. They are lined with ciliated cells, shown here. So that's cilia, that's that tiny hair-like structures that are found on some cells, and they sweep away foreign debris. Other cells will secrete mucus, which will clean the air by trapping foreign particles such as dust and bacteria. So these ciliated cells, they line the interior of the nasal passages and the upper respiratory tract. All right, so each breath contains an invisible mixture of dust, fungi, bacteria, water, gases that can enter the respiratory tract. So the mucus and cilia, they trap most of the dust, bacteria, and other particles before the mixture of air reaches the bronchioles. Any coughing and sneezing, it builds strong gusts of air that will force out many harmful items from the respiratory tract. So oxygen from the atmosphere will pass over warm, moist membranes in the nose and mouth, warming the air to a temperature that will not harm the lungs. All right, so that pharynx area here, it's like the throat It's the passageway for air into the respiratory system, as well as the passageway for food and water into the digestive system. So there is that flap I talked about before, this epiglottis right here. That's the structure that will cover the glottis, or the opening of the trachea during swallowing. So it's a flap of cartilage that lies behind the tongue and in front of the larynx. It prevents food and drink from entering the trachea and passing into the bronchi of the lungs. When the epiglottis is at rest, it is upright and it'll allow air to pass unobstructed into the lower respiratory tract. The larynx is here. That is the voice box. It's made from cartilage. It contains the vocal cords. And the trachea is also called the windpipe. It is strengthened by these semicircular cartilage arches that prevent it from collapsing. All right, we need this nice and open so that we can breathe. And then the lower respiratory tract consists of the bronchi. These are the passages from the trachea to the left and right lung. All right, so this trachea, this was the trachea. It now branches into the left and right lung, forming those bronchi. So inhaled air moves from the trachea into two bronchi. Singular is bronchus. It contains bands of cartilage, just like the trachea did, to keep it nice and open. The bronchi carry air into the right and left lungs, and then they will branch into many smaller airways called bronchioles. And the bronchiole is the smallest passageways of the respiratory tract. They do not contain any cartilage bands because now these branches are inside the lungs. Okay, so no cartilage inside the lungs. Air moves from the bronchioles into these tiny sacs called alveoli, which we'll take a look at. Singular is alveolus. Both the bronchi and the bronchioles are lined with cilia and mucus-producing cells, just like we saw in the upper respiratory tract. And the alveoli are those bulbous sacs of the lung, and that's where gas exchange occurs. So here we're looking at an alveolus. All right, so we have the lungs, and we're just looking at it close up here. The bronchiole, which came from the bronchi. The bronchiole are those smaller tubules, and then they end in these alveolus or alveoli sacs. And notice again, it's covered with this capillary network. So each bronchiole ends in several clusters of these alveoli, and surrounding each alveolus, it's this network of capillaries from the circulatory system, and that's where gas exchange will occur between the blood in the capillaries and the air in the alveolus, so that blood leaving the lungs has a high oxygen content. So the lungs, each lung is divided into distinct regions called lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes, and the left lung has only 2 lobes, leaving space for the heart. And each lobe is made up of many lobules that extend from each bronchiole. There's a pleural membrane, which is a thin membrane that surrounds the outer surface of the lungs, and it lines the inner wall of the chest cavity. It's a thin, double-layered membrane. The outer layer of the membrane is going to attach to the inside of the chest wall. The inner layer of the membrane attaches to the lungs. And these two membranes adhere to each other, and this adhesion is why the lungs expand, draw in air when the volume of the chest cavity is increased, and the space between the membranes is filled with a small amount of fluid to reduce any friction between the lungs and the chest cavity during inhalation. All right, so we're going to pause here and watch a couple of these videos.